Hello, my name is Jamie Paris. I'm giving this lecture on behalf of Corpus Christi College at UBC and is for English 1110 online. Today's discussion is called Reading Stories, or at least an introduction. Let's get started. So in this particular set, we're going to talk a little bit about the assignment. We're going to talk about the idea of fields and then their relationship to data. And we're going to talk about how to write a paragraph, an important skill. The bulk of today's discussion is going to be revolving around Flannery O'Connor, and we're going to be reading Everything That Rises Must Converge. And we're going to be looking specifically at logos, ethos, pathos, telos, and keratos. Now, I'm going to talk about all of these things as a group, as a way of organizing my thoughts about the story. I would strongly suggest, though, that when you think about these terms, especially if you want to write about O'Connor for your final paper, rather than thinking about all of them, you might want to think about any one of these terms. So how does logos work? How does ethos? How does pathos work? Rather than thinking about all of them as a group. I'm going to go through all of them as a group, though, because I just want to make sure that we're understanding the terms as we go forward. All right. So the assignment's been posted online, and I'm not going to go over it in this video, but I am going to encourage you to take some time and give it a good read. And if you have questions, I'm going to encourage you to email me your questions as soon as possible. Don't put this off to the last minute. It's not that kind of assignment. And I really want to stress that last part. It's not that kind of assignment. The fact is, I think it would be entirely possible with the close reading paper to have put off doing the close reading paper until 2 or 3 days before, written it, drafted it, sent it in, and to get a very good mark. The annotated bibliography, you're going to have to do all the reading in advance, and it's going to be fairly obvious if you haven't done all the reading in advance. The proposal, you're going to have to know kind of what you want to do before you start. So, again, you're going to have to do a little bit of prep work. And we mentioned this before, the whole long letter, short letter problem. It's really difficult to write a 250-word proposal. It's really easy to write a 1,000-word proposal. So you've got to kind of know what you want to say before you start writing if you want to do that well. Now, the way that this assignment is designed is it's got 3 phases. Phase 1 is an informal meeting to discuss your proposal by July 13th. So that's on or before. So I'll obviously book off the 12th and 13th for meetings. But if you want to get together 10th, 9th, 8th, that's fine. You just got to send me an email. I'll make it work. You guys are my priority for the rest of the summer, so we don't have to worry too much about scheduling. That meeting will be pass-fail. Basically, we have the meeting or we don't. I'm not going to look at that meeting and say, oh, well, you weren't prepared. Oh, well, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. I just want you to come to the meeting, be it over Skype or in person, with a really clear idea of what you want to talk about. Now, if you're doing this course and you're not synced up with the rest of the class, a couple of you are on different schedules, my hope is that everyone will be synced up by July 13th, but if you're not, you still have to have a meeting with me before you start the annotated bibliography. You can't just hand in the annotated bibliography without talking with me. To put it another way, I won't mark it. And if I won't mark it, you can't pass the class. You've got to put in the work to start early, okay? It's the nature of the beast. So the annotated bibliography and proposal should set you up for your final paper. And the final paper is going to be due August 7th. So you're basically going to have August 13th, talk to me, August 17th, so it's a fairly quick turnover. Get the annotated bibliography and proposal done. And then August 7th, final paper. So it's 1, 2, 3, bang, bang, bang. And this whole thing is worth 35% of your grade. 25% for the final paper, 10% for the proposal and bibliography. It's huge. It's a big part of what we're doing. And another way to think about that is a lot of you, if you get an A on this, you'll likely get an A in the course, almost surely. But if you put this off to the last minute and get a bad grade, it doesn't really matter how well you've done in the course. Up to that point, it'll be very difficult to recover, okay? It's a big assignment. The other thing I can tell you is in grad school, usually we have one assignment that's worth 100%. So an assignment being worth a lot, it's normal in the humanities, but it's nerve-wracking. And I can talk with you about the anxiety of that if you need to. All right. Fields and data. So when we think about a field, we might want to also think the other term that people use is branch of knowledge. These are communities. And it's important to remember these are real human communities. At the end of the day, every scholar working on everything from global warming to physical chemistry to Flannery O'Connor is a person. They have friends, they have allies, they have communities they belong to, scholarly associations that they go to meetings of. When I write within a field, I'm typically writing for other people who know all the background information in the field. For example, when I talk with you guys about Flannery O'Connor today, I'm going to explain who she is. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Gothic. I'm going to set her up. If I'm writing for Flannery O'Connor experts, I wouldn't do that. I would assume that they already know that stuff, that they might find it a little condescending for me to actually say who Flannery O'Connor was and where she was born, that sort of thing. Now, every field can be defined by its data and the way that it uses its data. And what I mean by that is complicated, but not. Obviously, every field has something it studies. Think about, sociology, psychology, like ology, study of. Every field, English has a study of something, women's studies something, physics studies something. Every field has data that comes from that study, that comes from paying close, careful attention to a thing. Anthropologist to culture, sociologist to social phenomena, and psychologist to the mind and human behavior. And every field can be defined by the way that it uses that data. For example, in English, we might think that we can make a psychological claim simply by reading someone like Flannery O'Connor's text, really looking carefully at the kind of psychological relationships she sets up, and that might tell us something really important about how the mind works. A psychologist would probably say no, that you have to talk to real people about that. A sociologist would say no, you've got to talk to thousands of people about that. An anthropologist would say no, we've got to think about these things on 1,000-year timescales if we really want to understand how people think and feel. In other words, what we consider data and what we consider usable data changes, and how we would use the data changes. A psychologist, for example, might look at Flannery O'Connor and say, oh wow, those are some really interesting insights in the mind, but then want to read 50 other books to get a real feel for how the mind was being discussed in the period. In contrast, an English scholar might be very happy to closely and carefully read all the works of Flannery O'Connor and then make a definitive statement about how she thinks about the mind. The other thing we have to remember here is that all scholarship is progressive. And again, this is why the community part matters. Think about conversations you have with your friends. Nothing is more frustrating than a conversation that repeats itself, or that goes on over and over again. There's a way in which scholars have a conversation, solve the problem they're addressing, and then move on to the next thing. They write the next paper with the assumption that everyone in the field remembers the thing they just talked about. A lot of what we have to do in university, and especially in graduate schools, we have to catch up to those conversations. Think back to that metaphor of Burke, the casting in your oar. This leads to a distinction between the implied and intended reader. An implied reader is a reader who knows everything necessary in order to understand a text. Think about this in terms of children's literature. A small child reading the ABCs might just need to know what the ABCs are, what letter shapes are, the relationship between the pictures and the letters, things of that nature. If the child wants to read Alice in Wonderland, it's got to be able to imagine other children, it's got to be able to imagine fantastic places, it's got to have some idea what a Cheshire Cat is, all that sort of thing. If the child wants to read Joyce, well, that would be really hard. Joyce is assuming a reader who knows existential philosophy. He's assuming a reader who can sustain attention for, a 400-page plot, something that most children have difficulty doing. Not all, by the way, but most. In other words, when we think of the implied reader, all we're thinking about is what's the bare minimum you have to know in order to be able to read the text. Most of the texts that we're reading for this course are written for public audiences. They're designed to be read by everybody. That's great because it means that students in first and second year can just grab them and read them. The downside to that is they kind of don't respond to their fields as well. They don't give you as representative a sample because they're not necessarily aimed at just the field. They're aimed at something broader. Now, the intended reader, sometimes called the ideal reader, is very different. An intended reader is the person you wrote the article for. For example, I'm just finishing my doctoral dissertation. It's on Shakespeare. It's the kind of topic that people like to talk about. It's the kind of topic I could write newspaper articles about. It's the kind of topic I could, go to Bard on the Beach and give a talk about. That's great, but my intended reader for my dissertation isn't any of those groups. My intended reader for my dissertation are other professional Shakespeareans who have read all the scholarship, who are going to be aware of the new insights I'm bringing to the field, things of that nature. That doesn't mean that someone else couldn't read it, but imagine you take something like a dissertation, and I don't know, I gave it to my mom. My mom would not even be the implied reader. She wouldn't know who half the people were. She'd have to look up a bunch of the words. She wouldn't understand all of Shakespeare's language. She would just be frustrated. Now, this might cause her, pull out her hair, to accuse me of being a bad writer, all these kinds of things. And I may be a bad writer, I don't know. But that's not the issue. The issue is sometimes when we don't understand a text, it's because we're not the intended reader of that text. Sometimes the text is assuming a reader who's inside a field and has a larger branch of knowledge. Sometimes, however, as a writer, when we think we're writing for popular audiences, when we think we're writing to be accessible, it turns out we're actually writing for implied readers who know significantly more than the people we're talking to. Really quickly, this is the difficulty of lecturing in a nutshell, especially online. I don't know what you know. I don't know what you're following. I can't look at you right now to see, are you nodding along? Are you agreeing? Are you understanding what I'm saying? I'm guessing, in other words, what you know and what you're able to do, what kind of implied reader you are. It's frustrating for me as a teacher. But even if we were in person, even if we were in the same room, I'm still guessing. You can never be sure someone understands something. Now, a lot of times when we lecture, especially when we're starting out, we'll get someone to come and watch us lecture. Now, that person might be our intended reader in the sense that they know everything that you need to know in order to be able to follow and understand what we're saying. But in a lecture situation, even if that person, say, is another Shakespearean who knows all the Shakespeare stuff I'm talking about, they're not the intended reader of that class because they're not a first year. So points where I go slow might bore them because they know this stuff and they want it to go faster. But that doesn't mean that I didn't get the lecture right. That could sometimes mean that they were not the intended reader. And that distinction, intended and implied, is important to think about when you're writing your essays. Always remember that I'm your intended reader. Your professor is the person you're writing for. A lot of times what this means is we have to be strategic. There are rules in writing and there are rules. We've covered this before, and I'll go over it one more time. What I mean is there are things that some professors just prefer. For example, I don't like comma splices. They really bother me. You'll work with other profs who don't care about that as much. They'll care about spelling mistakes more. They'll care about punctuation errors more. In contrast, there's stuff that matters for everyone. Hook statements. Nobody likes hook statements. They're frustrating, and you should avoid them at all costs. But to know to do that is to know who you're writing for. If you were writing for your classmates, people who just came out of the high school system, who are used to seeing writing with big hook statements in it, my desire to have you not write with a hook statement would actually be really frustrating for those readers. They might feel that it's hard to get into your paper. They don't have a hook or a place to start from because that's what they're used to reading. So a lot of times when we think about writing, we have to be aware that every rhetorical situation is created for a different intended reader. And you have to write for the situation you're writing for, not the situation you'd like to write for. One of the examples I brought up in the module this week is the difference between a eulogy and a roast. If you think about it, you actually talk about the same things at a eulogy and a roast. You put emphasis on different parts of it, but you talk about a lot of the same stuff. You talk about what makes someone special. You talk about their ethics. You talk about their friends. You talk about their community. But in a roast, you mock someone as a way of showing that they're a good sport, showing that they can take a joke, that sort of thing. In a eulogy, that would just be incredibly inappropriate, unless maybe you were eulogizing a comic or something like that. Or someone had given special instructions in their will that they wanted their eulogy to be like a roast. They wanted it to be particularly funny and mean-spirited. A lot of times we can say the right thing at the wrong time. We can lose that sense of chronos. Another way to think about this is think about the Confederate flag. And it's neat that we're reading Flannery O'Connor at this point in the year, given everything that's happening in the American South. If I were to make a reference to the Confederate flag right now, it would seem timely. And I would assume as implied readers that you would know that there was a major shooting in the U.S., that there's a major debate over whether or not South Carolina should have the Confederate flag in front of its courthouse. Or I would assume that if you didn't know that, you would pause the video and Google that to figure out what's going on. Like, I would assume you could catch up to that conversation. I could talk about that next year, and it would go nowhere with a class because it would no longer be a timely conversation. As implied readers, that class might be just as interested in, say, race and America, but it would move on to different conflicts and conversations, ones that maybe I couldn't even anticipate right now. So when we think about fields, we also want to think about timeliness. The reason why it matters to get up to speed in a field is because then we know what kinds of interventions are timely. All right, let's talk about Flannery O'Connor. So Flannery O'Connor is an American writer and essayist. She was born March 25th, 1925, and she died fairly young, August 3rd, 1964. Now, think about those dates, and what you're going to realize is Flannery O'Connor came of age during the height of the civil rights movement in the 50s and early 60s. She lives through Rosa Parks. She lives through Martin Luther King. She's going to, JFK. This was a major moment in America where it was coming to terms with its rather racist past. Now, Flannery O'Connor is also a Catholic writer. I'd say she's a small Catholic writer, small C Catholic. And what I mean by that is she's not a Catholic in the sense that her stories teach us how to be better Catholics or something like that. She's a Catholic in the sense that her works take up massive theological themes: evil, good, sin, redemption, even baptism. But she's also really interested in the way that people hide behind religion. The way that people will use something like a rosary to hide evil intent. She's aware of the fact that people wrap themselves, in the cross when they're at their most evil. I always remind students, when you want to think about this, think about the fact that in the South, the Ku Klux Klan articulated itself as a Christian organization and held meetings that were overtly Christian and talked about America as a Christian nation and a white nation. They saw no contradiction between these two things. Some would say a lot of American evangelicalism actually comes out of this moment, but that's maybe a bigger and more controversial topic than we need to get into today. Flannery O'Connor's coming out of that moment, though. And I think we should remember, too, she's a Catholic coming out of that moment, and Catholics in the South had a very different socio-cultural position than they had in the North, and than they would have in Canada today. Catholicism was very much a minority religion. As a matter of fact, when JFK ran for president of the United States, there was a point at which he had to kind of go on TV and formally declare that it was okay for him as a Catholic to be president and that he wouldn't be beholden to the Pope. This was an actual fear that evangelicals had, that the Pope would take over America if there was a Catholic running the country. That's a side issue. But again, it's fascinating just to understand the flavor of the period. Now, Flannery O'Connor deals with race in the South, and she's often called a Southern Gothic writer. When we think of the Gothic, we should think of scary houses, we should think of ghost stories, we should think of Twilight, we should think about stories with the unexplainable. But I would suggest the Gothic is really about haunting. Think about the way that history can haunt the present. Think about the way that families have stories. And some of those stories are stories we can talk about openly and honestly. And some of them are things that can only be whispered about at a family reunion. They kind of haunt the family. They're things maybe we're not totally proud of. O'Connor was interested in that kind of haunted South. She was interested in the South as a place that was haunted by its history, unable to quite fully move on because of the memory of what it once was. She often took up the task of explaining, but not apologizing, for the South to the North. So her major readers were Northerners, people in Canada. But what she does, and we're really going to talk about this today with this particular story, is Flannery O'Connor never makes races seem evil, but she also never condones what they're doing. And I think that's important because it's about humanizing. She humanizes people who we might look down our nose at if we're not careful. Finally, Flannery O'Connor's work is about details and the way that the mundane can become significant. She's a major influence on the Canadian short story writer Alice Munro. Flannery O'Connor can take a small detail, and we'll talk about these today, like a newspaper, and they explode with meaning for Flannery O'Connor because she knows how to say something and just put the text there and allow the reader to do the work of figuring out what the text means. All right. So let's start. Everything that rises must converge. It's an interesting title, and we'll come back to that title in just a second. So the story essentially is about Julian and his mother getting on a bus to go to the Y so that Julian's mother can take a fitness class. The bus trip goes poorly. Julian's mother tries to give a penny to a small black child who she's become fond of. The black child's mother gets very angry. We're not entirely sure what happens between Julian's mother and the black woman, but Julian's mother ends up on the ground, and she seems to have a bit of a psychotic break. She literally breaks down just a little bit, and the story ends with Julian castigating her. Okay. Now, when I start a story, and everyone who reads these things is different, but when I start a story, I like to begin by really close reading the first paragraph and the last paragraph. I feel like the way that an author introduces and leaves a story tells us a lot about what they think is important. And sometimes we can identify our key themes. So, if you'll indulge me, and you have to, since you're not here to stop me, I'm going to just go through this first paragraph in some detail. Her doctor had told Julian's mother that she must lose 20 pounds on account of her blood pressure. So on Wednesday nights, Julian had to take her downtown on the bus for a reducing class at the Y. The reducing class was designed for working girls over 50, who weighed from 165 to 200 pounds. His mother was one of the slimmer ones, but she said ladies did not tell their age or weight. She would not ride the bus by herself at night, since they had been integrated. And because the reducing class was one of her few pleasures, necessary for her health, and free, she said Julian could at least put himself out to take her, considering all she did for him. Julian did not like to consider all she did for him, but every Wednesday night he braced himself and took her. Okay. Now again, it's loaded with details. The first thing we should notice is that Julian's mother doesn't have a name. She is Julian's mother. She is understood in this story in terms of her relationship to her son. That seems important. She only goes to the class because her doctor told her that she must lose 20 pounds on account of her blood pressure. And again, blood pressure is one of those funny medical conditions where sometimes blood pressure is a euphemism for stress. So on Wednesday nights, Julian had to take her. Notice that had to take her. There's a sense of resistance built into that. Julian had to take her. He had no choice. The doctor controls Julian's mother. Julian's mother controls Julian. Julian is caught up in something larger than himself. But it's the most mundane of something larger than himself. It's not caught up in the tides of history. He's not caught up in a war. He's caught up in his mother's deciding to reduce her blood pressure. There's something sad about that. Take her downtown on a bus for a reducing class at the Y. Now, the downtown matters. This is a story set in the early 1960s during the height of the desegregation moment. And one of the things that was happening as blacks were getting more and more rights and prestige in America was something that sociologists call white flight. The way white flight works is white people who lived in inner city neighborhoods were happy to live there as long as those neighborhoods were segregated. That is, as long as blacks couldn't afford to live there and or there were policies that made it clear that blacks weren't allowed to live there. During the age of desegregation, what we start seeing are rent apartments being... Landlords basically no longer have the right not to rent to blacks. Property and rent values go down for a lot of complicated reasons, all having to do with racism at the end of the day. And whites move to the suburbs as soon as they possibly can. So we get that kind of flight from the suburbs. So the fact that Julian and his mom live in the suburbs matters. But don't assume because they live in the suburbs and they're going downtown that they're wealthy. This becomes a theme as we go on. The class itself, and I love this, again, Flannery O'Connor is so smart and clever. The reducing class. Just think about that phrase. Julian's mother has to go to the reducing class. At the same moment, she is being reduced in class. So she literally has to go to a place to be reduced. At the same moment, socially, she is being reduced. Well, you almost feel sorry for her. There's almost a sense of empathy here. The class is designed for working girls over 50. Just think about how condescending that phrase is. Would we ever call women over 50 who worked working girls? That's a phrase we reserve for 18-year-olds, maybe, but certainly not for 50-year-old women, who weighed from 165 to 200 pounds. Notice how important that cutoff is. It's such a mundane detail, but it matters. These are women who are overweight, but not too overweight. They're not 205, they're not 207, they're 200. They're not 160, 165. These aren't women who maybe want to lose a couple pounds. They're women who need to lose a couple pounds. But there's also a sense of a beauty myth being created here. There's nothing wrong with a woman in her 50s weighing 165 pounds. It'd be silly to pretend otherwise. Notice as well, there's a status here. Julian's mother was one of the slimmer ones, right? As if the women are to be compared this way. But she said ladies did not tell their age or weight. I don't know if this is true or false of the South, but what Flannery O'Connor is setting up here is, well, wait a minute, if ladies don't tell their age or weight, what do they tell? What establishes status in these worlds? She would not ride the bus by herself at night, since they had been integrated. Integrated is a lovely Southern euphemism. One of the things that the Southerners are great at is they can say the rudest, most racist thing straight to your face, and it sounds polite. The buses being integrated is not what Julian's mother is worried about. She's worried about buses that have black passengers on them at night, right? As if she is in some kind of implicit danger because of this integration. The reducing classes were one of her few pleasures. Again, she's a bit of a martyr. This comes up in the story. Necessary for her health and free. So what makes the class pleasurable? Well, 1, she gets to drag her son. 2, the class is necessary for her health, so she's not doing something excessive. 3, the class itself is free. So there's a sense that, how do I put this? She's cheap. This is a cheap woman. Think about that whole, hat. Is she going to return the hat thing that happens in the story? Now, Julian does not want to take her. He does not want to consider all that she did for him. Julian does not want to empathize with his mother. He doesn't want to see the world from his mother's point of view. But every Wednesday night, he braces himself and takes her. Every Wednesday night, he goes through the ritual. Think about how the story implies that this is a great hardship. At the end of the day, Julian's big responsibility as a son is getting on a bus with his mother once a week. It's not exactly the hardest of things to do, especially because Julian clearly lives with his mom. Let's look at the last paragraph. We're on page 291. Wait here, he cried, jumped up, and began to run for help towards a cluster of lights he saw in the distance ahead of him. Help! Help! He shouted, but his voice was thin, scarcely a thread of sound. The lights drifted farther away the faster he ran, and his feet moved numbly, as if they carried him nowhere. The tide of darkness seemed to sweep him back to her, postponing from moment to moment his entry into the world of guilt and sorrow. I like this passage because if you think about the logic, what is Julian trying to accomplish? Well, what he's trying to accomplish is not get help for his mother who's laying on the ground, who's sickly. He's trying to, I think the best way to read this, he's trying to run away from her. He's trying to get help from her. And there's something about a tide of darkness that is pulling him back to his mother. Well, what he wants to do is enter into a world defined by hurt and sorrow. All right, so let's go through our terms here. So in terms of the kairos, or timeliness, of course this is set in the early 1960s during the desegregation of the South, as I mentioned before. Rosa Parks is an important intertext. We might remember the story of Rosa Parks, but just a quick refresher. Rosa Parks was working all day, and she gets onto a bus, and the bus was segregated. And the way the bus segregation worked was she was allowed on the bus, as long as she agreed to ride on the back of the bus. The story tells us that Rosa Parks was particularly tired that day, wasn't going to accept riding on the back of the bus, and sat down at the front. She was promptly arrested, taken to jail, and this began a large part of the civil rights movement with the desegregation of buses. For blacks, she was a hero who fought for her rights, not necessarily by doing anything, but just by pointing out the injustice. They particularly liked her because she was a respectful woman. She was a working woman. She was someone who no one could hate. In contrast, Southern whites hated Rosa Parks. And there's been a movement in America to claim her as a national hero, but if you read the newspaper articles written about her in the period, what you see right away was she was perceived as uppity. She didn't know her place. There was no reason for her to do this. She should apologize for breaking the law. That was the sort of narrative that was around Rosa Parks at the time. Now, the other thing we want to think about is this repetition. Rome was not built in a day. Let's look at two of the moments where this happens. First one's on 274. So Julian is talking with his mother before they get on the bus. "Someday, I'll start making money," Julian said gloomily. He knew he never would. "And you can have one of those jokes whenever you take the fits." But first they would move. He visualized a place where the nearest neighbor would be 3 miles away on either side. "I think you're doing fine," she said, drawing on her gloves. "You've only been out of school a year. Rome wasn't built in a day." Now, to some degree, the phrase "Rome wasn't built in a day" is a call for patience. It's a call to, accept the fact that it takes a while to get things done. But think about our context. "Someday, I'll start making money," Julian said gloomily. He knew he never would. Julian is coming from a family that is falling in America. It's a family that has lost its wealth. There are hints of it throughout the book. And he's suggesting that she can joke about Julian's paying as much as she wants after he starts making money. But now, when that lack of money is shameful, she should not. She should avoid that kind of joke. But first they would move. Notice when Julian imagines making money, when he imagines getting on his feet, he also imagines bringing his mother with him. They would move together. He visualized a place where the nearest neighbor would be 3 miles away on either side. The two of them would go somewhere else. Some of you might ask, well, wait a minute, if Julian's imagining a house that he's going to earn after college, shouldn't he be imagining a place where he can live with a wife and children, not his mother? Now think about that phrase, "I think you're doing fine." My grandma loved phrases like that. My grandma was a wonderful, proud black woman from the South. "I think you're doing fine." It would have been a great Southernism for her. And you can say "I think you're doing fine" in a way that implies you're doing really well and I'm proud of you. But "I think you're doing fine" can also be the most backhanded of things to say to somebody. "I think you're doing fine" doesn't mean well, doesn't mean good. It means you're adequate. But also the of "you're doing fine" is in what you are doing is adequate given the limitations of who you are. There's a way in which telling someone, especially someone sad, you're doing the best that you can, is also implying, I don't think you can do any more. But Rome wasn't built in a day. I'm starting to wonder as a reader, does Rome have significance? Let's look at 280 and see if maybe Rome itself has a little bit of significance. So here, Julian's mother is on the bus. We're actually going to start at 279, okay? "What gets my goat is all these boys from good families stealing automobile tires," the woman said with protruding teeth. "I told my boy, I said, you may not be rich, but you've been raised right, And if I ever catch you in any such mess, they can send you on to the reformatory. Be exactly where you belong. Now, reformatory, just so we're clear, it's kind of like going to juvie, but it's not exactly the same. In the period, if you were a white kid from a good family, you'd be sent to a reformatory, which is like a boot camp. You learn, you do some push-ups, you become respectful. That's different than being sent to jail. So there's a kind of class implication in being sent to the reformatory. Notice that she has to consent. Black families weren't asked if their children were going to go to jail. White families were given the option of whether or not their child would be sent to the reformatory. Training tells, his mother said. Is your boy in high school? 9th grade, the woman said. My son just finished college last year. He wants to write, but he's selling typewriters until he gets started, his mother said. The woman leaned forward and peered at Julian. He threw her such a malevolent look that she subdued against her seat. On the floor across the aisle there was an abandoned newspaper. He got it and opened it up in front of him. His mother discreetly continued the conversation in a lower tone. But the woman across the aisle said in a loud voice, Well, that's nice. Selling typewriters is close to writing. He can go right from one to the other. I tell him, his mother said, that Rome wasn't built in a day. Okay, let's think about this passage. It's a rich passage. The first thing we want to be aware of is good families. What does the phrase good families mean? I think the implication here is it's a white family. But think about the woman's diction. I told my boy, I said, you may not be rich, but you've been raised right. Now, if this was an educated woman, she would have said, I told my boy that you may not be rich, but you have been raised right. She got the verb tense wrong. Maybe that's nothing. And if I ever catch you in any such mess, then you can, sorry, it's hard to read. It's hard to read her diction. It's amazing. They can send you on to the reformatory. They can send you on. Again, it's a Southernism, but it's a poor Southernism. It's the kind of thing you would say if you came from the lower classes, the working classes. Be exactly where you belong. Again, Southernism, but it's a marker of class. It's something you would say if you were poor. In other words, there's a class dynamic going on here. And if we think about good families, but boys stealing automobile tires, isn't this the marker of not being raised right? Like imagine this today. Imagine talking to a woman who tells you that her kid was raised right. She's got a good kid, they're a good family, but her kid steals cars. Wouldn't your first thought be like, no, something's wrong there? Maybe, you didn't raise your boy wrong, but that's not a boy who was raised right. That's not everything's okay. Something's weird about that situation. Think about the phrase training tells. Right? There's a sense of, they're talking about education, so certainly the training here is school education. But again, as a Southernism, training is about being cultured. It's about knowing what to do and when to do it. Now, notice that she pulls rank. This is gorgeous. Is your boy in high school? Right? So there's a sense of like, what grade is your boy in? She doesn't ask, is your boy in college? She doesn't ask, what kind of work does your boy do? And there's no reason to assume that the boy's not a normal working guy, other than the fact that he steals tires. But is your boy in high school is a way of asking, do I have seniority over you? 9th grade, the woman said. My son just finished college last year. Notice how the two women talk about their children like possessions? My boy, my son. My boy just finished college. My boy selling typewriters. My boy wants to be a writer. There's a sense of possession here that matters. And we're going to skip the part about telling that, but I want us to turn 280. I tell him, his mother said, that Rome wasn't built in a day. Now, she's not offering this to Julian as a way of making his life easier. There's no empathy implied in this. She's telling the woman about this so the woman can nod her head and go, yeah, You're a good mother. Good for you for telling your son to be patient. Good for you for having patience with your lazy child. When we see Julian picking up the newspaper and withdrawing into himself, the simplest way to think of this is, we do this today. If you're talking about a kid in front of them and you say something embarrassing, first thing the kid's going to do is pull out their phone, pull out their iPad, maybe put their headphones on. They'll visibly demonstrate that they're not interested in the conversation. Okay, so notice what I've done here. I've looked at a particular time reference. Rome wasn't built in a day. And it's given me a way to think about what's going on in the story in terms of its timeliness. Now, I'm also starting to get at this idea of pathos, just by taking this small element. Notice how what Julian wants is a feeling with. He wants his mother to have empathy with him. But his mother feels about him, just like she feels about Negroes. She feels about the boy, or feels at him. So there's a distinction here, and we can trace this through the story if we want to, where Julian wants to be loved. He wants his mother to understand him on his terms. The mother is completely unwilling. Now, let's turn to page 290 here. 290. Talk a little bit about pathos. So again, pathos is the sense of emotion. Right? Or, sorry, ethos, I should say. So ethos is the sense of the argument or the point. So this is shortly after Julian's mother has been potentially assaulted. We're not entirely sure. But we have, let's actually turn to 289. She took the hand and, breathing hard, pulled heavily up on it, and then stood for a moment, swaying slightly, as if the spots of light in the darkness were circling around her. Her eyes, shadowed and confused, finally settled on his face. He did not try to conceal his irritation. "I hope this teaches you a lesson," he said. She leaned forward, and her eyes raked his face. She seemed trying to determine his identity. Then, as if she found nothing familiar about him, she started off with a headlong movement in the wrong direction. She's going away from her son. She's giving up on him. She's turning away. She looks to the son, and she doesn't recognize him. But it's not the physical she doesn't recognize. Think about what Julian says to her. She's just had a fall. She's been shamed and embarrassed. "I hope this teaches you a lesson," as if he is the father and she is nothing but a mere child. "Aren't you going to the Y?" he asked. "Home," she murmured. "Well, are we walking?" Think about home, right? Home's a place. It's a physical location. We go home. But home's also a sense of emotions. It's a sense of beliefs. It's a sense of values. In German, we have the term unheimlich. And unheimlich means the unholy, or the unhomely, the unnatural. Places that feel alien to you. There's a sense here that the world has become unheimlich for Julian's mom. There's a sense that there's something strange about it. And what she murmurs, what she wants now is just home. A return to the way things were. "Well, are we walking?" For answer, she kept going. Julian followed along, his hands behind him. He saw no reason to let the lesson she had go without backing it up with an explanation of its meaning. Again, Flannery O'Connor, so smart. He saw no reason to let the lesson go. Julian might be smarter than his mother, but he's not very emotionally intelligent. This is a beaten woman. She's going through a horrible ordeal. And Julian is going to take this as the moment to kick his mother while she's down. There's no chance his mother's going to learn anything about race or racism at this moment. All she's going to learn is that things are bad. She might as well be made to understand what had happened to her. In other words, Julian might as well give it meaning. "Don't think that was just an uppity Negro woman," he said. That was the whole colored race, which will no longer take your condescending pennies. That was your black double. She can wear the same hat as you, and, to be sure," he added gratuitously, because he thought it was funny, It looked better on her than it did on you. What all this means, he said, is that the old world is gone. The old manners are obsolete. Your graciousness is not worth a damn. He thought bitterly of the house that had been lost from him. You aren't who you think you are, he said. Now, this is why we have to be good, close readers. There's a detail here, and the first 3-4 times I read the story, I missed it. He thought bitterly of the house that had been lost for him. At some point in the family history, and we don't know when, Julian's was supposed to inherit. He was supposed to inherit a house. This house had been lost for him. Julian didn't lose it. Someone else did. We don't know exactly what happened, but we know that this is a falling family. Julian's phrase, "You aren't who you think you are," is basically a way of telling his mother, "You're not the gracious southern lady you think you are. That was your black double. You're the same as black people." That empathy makes sense. But again, notice the twisting of the knife. She can wear the same hat as you, and to be sure, it looked better on her than it did on you. There's no reason to add that. There's no reason to kick her while she's down. It is exactly gratuitous. But so is everything Julian is saying. What all this means, he says, is that the old world is gone. Now, there's something ironic about this. If we want to get the ethos, we've got to get the irony. The old world is exactly not gone. The fact that the woman was pissed off that another woman offered her son a penny has everything to do with the fact that slavery is not gone. That history, that racist, condescending history, is still part of the world. It haunts the present. The old world is not gone. The old manners are not obsolete. Your graciousness is not worth a damn. These things aren't true. Being polite, having good manners does still matter. Being gracious still matters. What doesn't matter is your graciousness. It's not like you, as a white woman, are condescending to give attention to black people anymore. That's lost. You aren't who you think you are. Now, in terms of the logos, in terms of the argument here then, you'll notice what I'm trying to get at. What I'm suggesting is that Julian's mother is not a character we should admire. She's not a good character. She's not morally upright. She clearly says horribly racist things. For example, let's turn to page 275. You remain what you are, she said. Your great-grandfather had a plantation and 200 slaves. There are no more slaves, he said irritably. They were better off when there were, she said. He groaned to see that she was off on that topic. She rolled into it every few days like a train on an open track. He knew every stop, every junction, every swamp along the way, and he knew the exact point at which her conclusion would roll majestically into the station. It's ridiculous. It's simply not realistic. They should rise, yes, but on their own side of the fence. Let's skip it, Julian said. The ones I feel sorry for, she said, are the ones that are half white. They're tragic. Will you skip it? Suppose we were half white. We would certainly have mixed feelings. I have mixed feelings now, he groaned. Well, let's talk about something more pleasant, she said. And then the thing she talks about that's more pleasant is remembering going to her grandpa's house. Her grandpa, we just found out, had 200 slaves. In other words, her memory is more pleasant because she was on the right side of the slave line. Now, as a mixed race person, I'm of course devastated by this line. The ones that are half white are the ones who are tragic. They'd have mixed feelings. I can tell you, yes, we do have mixed feelings. So does everyone else, as Julian points out. But his mother is an unrepentant racist. They were better off when they were slaves. What she really means, of course, is we were better off when they were slaves. Can't they rise, but rise on their own? Think about this in terms of contemporary arguments about gay marriage if you want to understand what O'Connor's getting at. Now, for example, I can totally understand how a biblical scholar talks himself into believing that there's a definition of biblical marriage. And I can understand how a biblical scholar would then want to say we should distinguish between marriage as it's biblically defined and marriage as it's defined in civil society. That makes sense to me. But the idea that gay people shouldn't be married because that's not what the word marriage means is on its face ridiculous. Marriage is a changing, evolving cultural institution. Pretty much all the scholarship says that. That doesn't mean that people should not be homophobic, or there are better reasons that people should be homophobic, like not being jerks. But what it does mean, and I think this is important, is a lot of times what people will say is, look, I'm not a racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not homophobic. I just want people who are different than me to be somewhere else. And what O'Connor is reminding us is that that ethics, that pity, that piety, is the essence of racism. When Julian's mother says the slaves were better off in the plantation, we have to assume that a character like her means it. She really does believe that the slaves she saw on the plantation when she was a girl were happy. There's also this sense of what makes a person who they are. And the argument that Julian and his mother have is a really simple one. Julian wants to say who you are, what makes you you, what makes you cultured, is what you've learned. It's in the mind, as he puts it. Julian's mother says no, it's breeding, it's race, it's the culture you grew up in. Now, does the text side with Julian or with Miss Chestney, Julian's mother? I think what makes Flannery O'Connor amazing is that she's ambiguous on this. As much as Miss Chastity's positions on race are horrific, as much as I don't like anything that she says, she makes Julian such a miserable character that his liberalism, his desire for blacks to be equal, his radical opinions, they come across not as the opinions of a child trying to educate his mother, but as the opinions of a child who found the one issue that would hurt his mother the most and is taking the opposite position just to hurt his mother. In other words, Miss Chastity's position sounds genuine. Julian's position sounds like it was taken simply to hurt his mother. O'Connor's getting us to ask a really difficult question. Is it worth having racial equality at the expense of bad faith? Is it worth having racial equality if the people who want it don't want it because they understand it, don't want it because they really view blacks as people? They want it because they want to hurt other people. The same thing happens with gay rights all the time. There are tons of people who are gay rights advocates, not because they really believe in the causes, but because their parents, their grandparents are deeply conservative. And by taking this position, they know they can hurt them. O'Connor's making us realize that this kind of false piety is just as detrimental as racism, and that we have to see the issue for what it is, and not for all the emotions surrounding it. Alright, so what have I done here? Well, I've shown you how I would begin the process of close reading. And one of the things you should have noticed from what I did is I don't go, here's point A, here's point B, here's point C. I walked through this. I would take this as notes, and then I would write it up as an essay. Point 2. I don't go in order of events in the story. I go in order of what I want to talk about. If I were writing about this as a paper, I might take one or two of the specific topics. For example, the idea of ethos. And I would turn that into a paper. I might think about the role of ethos, say, in Flannery O'Connor. And you could argue David Suzuki actually uses a very similar structure. Yes, it's not a story, but they both use ethos, or this relationship between pathos and ethos, to make their point. They blend the two of them. The feeling with, feeling about, feeling at problem. Alright, that's all I'm going to say for today. Thank you, and I hope that this works for everyone, and we'll talk soon.